Okay, so I've totally said before, and meant it, that when it comes to telling the stories of the people in the Bible who are women, I can't even imagine. And that's true, in the sense that I just don't know what it's like to be a woman, and because of that, I have no idea what it's like to be put in the types of situations in which women tend to find themselves. The pattern of sin's effect on the lives of people like me is decidedly different from the pattern that befalls people of the opposite sex. So different that I can't even imagine. However, you are smart, and you've probably noticed that that is also a total cop-out. We don't know much about Bilhah, where she comes from or who her people were. We have no details of her life before she enters the narrative of Genesis or after she leaves it, and only a very few details of her life during. It's rather hard to imagine what her life had been and would be like. These are the details we do have by which we can try to imagine what it was like to be Bilhah. When we meet her, she is Laban's servant. Well, probably his wife's servant. But Laban gave her to their daughter Rachel when she became the second wife of their nephew Jacob. Bilhah became Rachel's attendant and maidservant, which meant being counted among the property of Jacob. Also counted as Jacob's property was his first wife, Leah, who was also Rachel's sister, and the sister wives of Jacob got into a contest to see who could give their husband the most sons. Leah took an early lead and gave birth to Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Rachel yelled at Jacob, "Give me children or I'll die." Jacob yelled back, "Am I in the place of God who has kept you from having children?" Rachel answered that with a plan. "Here is Bilhah, my servant. Sleep with her, so that she can bear children for me, and I too can build a family through her." We don't hear what Bilhah had to say about that. That's just what they did. It worked. Bilhah gave birth to a son, whom Rachel called Dan, saying, "God has vindicated me. He has listened to my plea and given me a son." They stuck to the plan, and Bilhah also bore a son whom Rachel named Naphtali, saying, "I have had a great struggle with my sister, and I have won." We don't know what Bilhah would have wanted to call them, or if she ever had other kids of her own. Of her own whom she also got to keep and name and raise as her own. And besides, as the biological mother of Dan and Naphtali, we don't hear about Bilhah anymore, except for one sentence saying that Leah's oldest, Reuben, slept with Bilhah at some point after Rachel's death. Jacob heard about it after the fact and held that against Reuben. Again, we don't know anything about how Bilhah felt about it. Can we even imagine? I don't want to. I don't want to imagine. That's why I cop out. That's why I take the easy out by saying, I'm a guy. I can't imagine what it's like to be a woman. Not because I can't imagine, but because I don't want to. Because I can imagine what it was like to be Bilhah. I have a great imagination. I just don't want that imagination engaged on imagining culturally condoned sexual slavery. I don't want to imagine being told to sleep with my boss's husband to produce children who will be taken from me. I don't want to imagine not being sure whether or not I've been raped, not being sure whether or not the children I carried were in any way mine, not being sure if what Reuben did was rape or incest or both. I don't want to think about any of that. I don't want to imagine it happening to anyone. I don't want to imagine what if that were me. And what I really mean when I say I can't imagine is I'm glad I don't have to. And that's the most cop-outest part of it all. I'm a guy. So this is a category of stuff that I just don't have to think about if I don't want to. I bet Bilhah didn't want to. I bet it would have been easier for her if she just didn't think about it. Her culture encouraged her not to think about it, to think of her sexuality as an asset that belonged to her masters along with the children produced thereby, to think of her boss's consent as enough to wipe away any feelings of violation she may have experienced, to think of it all as her lot in life, allotted by fate or chance or even God, to accept it and not worry about the semantics of slavery, virginity, adultery, abuse, rape, incest, consent, autonomy, reproductive rights, sex trafficking, sex work, sexuality, sex. I bet Bilhah would have found it easier to just go numb to it all. And I imagine that, because that seems to be what my culture encourages too. Numbness. A semantic minefield that's best just accepted and lived with, allotted to us by biology and socialization and orientation, fate, because sinners love to do whatever we can get away with, and we can get away with sexual sin by wiping away the feelings of violation that we inflict on ourselves with semantic arguments and philosophy and pronouns and science and social norms and whatever we can get our hands on, really, because we don't want to imagine reality. That it's all sin, that God's beautiful gift of sex has been ruined for us and by us. And even when it's not our fault, it is. So numbness seems like a good solution. And it's one that's traditionally easier for men than women in a lot of cultures. Sex wasn't designed for numbness, though. It wasn't designed for sin. It isn't up to fate or chance. Sex and everything about it is supposed to be a blessing. So what I get out of imagining what it's like to be someone like Bilhah is a reminder to imagine what it would be like to be someone like me, only without all my sin. A reminder to imagine things the way they are supposed to be, the way God designed them to be, to imagine God's blessings unruined by sin, and to wish for that, to long for that, to hope for that, and remember that that's still what God wants for us. That's still the goal. Our sin ruins His gifts, and the better the gift, the more sin ruins it, but not forever, not permanently. Numbness isn't the solution. Jesus is. Can I imagine what Bilhah's life was like? Probably not very accurately. It was probably worse than I can imagine in some ways, better than I can imagine in others, just different, I suppose. But trying gives me something useful, a reminder of how different things are supposed to be from how they are, and of how different things will be when Jesus puts them back. And that reminder helps me to want to try to put them back in whatever way I can, to do what Jesus wants me to do with things, all the things, including but not limited to sex, and imagination, and semantics, and culture. And sin isn't what any of that is designed for, and numbness is no solution to sin. Jesus is. By taking sins away, He unruins everything. Imagine that, and try to live it. You and I are Dust and Breath, loved by God, bought by Jesus. This podcast is written and produced by me, Ethan Cherney, a Wells pastor serving Bethel Lutheran Church of Menasha, Wisconsin. Get in touch on Facebook at Dust and Breath Pod, on Twitter at Dust Breath Pod, or by emailing dustandbreathpod@gmail.com. Outro music arranged and performed by Mr. Peter Shavy, who is like apples of gold in settings of silver. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you could leave a review in iTunes or just share an episode on social media, I'd really appreciate it. It's the only way other people can find the show. Now, go do what God made you to do. Be who God called you to be. Go see what God can do with dust and breath and faith in Jesus, his Son.